Hosting our discussion today is Dr. James Carafano, who serves as Vice President of our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He is a 25-year veteran of the Army. He is a prolific writer and researcher, as well as an accomplished historian and teacher, and of course, one of the co-authors of our publication we're discussing again today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carafano. Jim?
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. So 10 years ago, Paul and I and a team of researchers here at Heritage wrote this book, Winning the Long War. So we had this to just say, look, we were right? So here we are 10 years later, and we're still at war. We were a little surprised, a little gratified, a little puffed up when the Bush administration actually began adopting the term the Long War and started using it instead of the kind of gawky or awkward global war on terrorism. We were even more deeply honored when the Democratic-controlled Congress actually told the Pentagon that they would refuse to take any appropriations proposals that were justified by the long war. So we were actually banned by Congress. So that was, doesn't get much better than that. But more importantly, the reason why we did the book was it wasn't just identifying it as a long war, but the recognition that you fight long wars differently. So wars become long because the enemies can't come, or the competitors can't come into a direct confrontation and kind of end it all. And so most long wars turn into wars of attrition where the two sides exhaust themselves over time. And the few examples where countries actually exit a long war stronger and more robust and resilient than when they started are very, very rare. And what's common in all of them is they won not just because they defeated the enemy, but over time they maintained and strengthened their core competitive advantage. And so the question we were trying to address in the book were, what are the core competitive advantages that America has that are essential to our strength and well-being that we have to support and sustain over time, even as we deal with the enemy that confronts us? And we really identified four. Most importantly, the liberties and privacy of individual citizens, because being a free society is really the nation's greatest strength. Obviously, there's a security dimension. You have to be able not just to protect yourself, but at some point take the battle to the enemy and defeat them. Winning the war of ideas is crucial because all wars at the end are really won in the minds of men and women when they decide to put down their arms and stop fighting. And fundamentally undergirding all of that is really the economic dimension, not just to pay for the security that you have to provide, but also to keep the society healthy and prosperous. So safe and secure, sustaining or protecting the privacies and liberties of your citizens, respecting those of your allies, and promoting human rights for all, prosperity and free market economy, and winning the war of ideas. Those were kind of the four essential tasks that we laid out in the book. And what I thought would be worth doing to mark the 10th year anniversary of the publication of the book is to bring together the four smartest people I know, who also I can twist their arm a little, make them come here, and give us an assessment of where we are in each one of these pillars and what we ought to be doing. So I'm just going to very, very briefly introduce our panel. I'm going to ask each of them to kind of do 10 minutes kind of assessing where the nation is in kind of their pillar and where we ought to be going. And then we'll have some time at the end. I'd like to open it up and do questions, and I promise we will adjourn promptly at 2:30. So to my left is Paul Rosenzweig. Paul is a visiting fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, he was in the Department of Homeland Security, where he was the number 2 guy in the policy office. And before that, Paul was actually at Heritage, and we were colleagues. And actually, one of the first big projects we worked on was this book together. So our association goes back a long time. Paul has extensive experience in the issues of dealing with civil liberties and security, and particularly in the area of cybersecurity. So really, you couldn't ask for a more talented person, except the guy to his left. David Shedd is also a visiting fellow here at Heritage, but more importantly, he is the former Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and had a long service in the Central Intelligence Agency. So he is probably one of the most experienced security practitioners in the federal government until he recently retired. And so having him address the issue of how safe and secure are we today and where we need to go from here, it's just a great honor to have him. Seb Gorka is well known in the war of ideas. I'm sure there is nobody who's more hated by the Islamists around the world than Seb. Seb is
Maybe here's the other.
Yep, maybe. Seb is the Horner Professor at the Marine Corps University. He also is a prolific author, a tremendous scholar, and is widely consulted with by various federal agencies for his expertise on the threat of global Islamism and terrorism. And finally, Steve Moore. Steve's also a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, he was with the Wall Street Journal, helped found the Club for Growth, one of the country's most well-known and prolific economists, including an author of 4 books, right? Something like that, who knows? And so I think what we'll do is we'll just go from some left to right. So maybe we'll start with economics, because unless you can pay for everything, it's hard to do anything. So Steve, maybe you'll kick us off, and then we'll just go down the line. And you guys can talk from there or the podium, whatever you're more comfortable.
I'll sit here. Thank you, James, for putting this together. And you put it quite right, that if you don't have the budget to spend on these things that you need to win wars, then you're in a lot of trouble. And look, Reagan said it best, that when you're strong at home, you're strong abroad, and when you're strong abroad, you're strong at home. And one of the reasons that we are, I think, facing all sorts of conflicts around the world is, quite frankly, we're not strong at home, and that has made us, I think, more vulnerable to the kinds of threats that we would see from our foreign rivals. It's not, I was thinking about this last night, I was just preparing some remarks for this, that it's not a coincidence that some of the major events in our history where we have been under attack have come at times when we have been weak at home and our economy has not functioned. So it's not a coincidence that the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor during the last days of the Great Depression, when our economy was so depressed. And famously it was said that the Japanese awakened a sleeping giant, and that's exactly what happened. Our industrial system really came into play, and we simply won World War II by outproducing everyone else. And by the way, the same thing was true of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was won because of the Reagan vision that we were going to outspend them, that we were going to outproduce them, and we were going to defeat communism because our free enterprise system was going to be so bountiful in terms of the production, the industrial production we could produce, that they couldn't keep pace with us. And I would make the case that's exactly what happened, that the Soviets simply could not keep pace with American industrial production in the 1980s, and that's when they threw in the towel. Now that brings us to, let me just one other thing. I think it's fairly obvious, but why did the North beat the South in the Civil War? The North beat the South because the North outproduced the South, that it became an industrial giant, and the South couldn't produce the weapons or the output or the food and the other kinds of inputs that are needed to win a war. Which brings us to today. We are weak right now. Our economy has grown at 2%, James, now for 7 straight years. That's way below where we should be. Joel Griffith and I have put together some of these numbers, that if we had just an average recovery from recession, we'd have about $2 trillion more output in 2015. That's a big number. 2 trillion is a really big number, and given the fact that a portion of what we produce goes to national defense, it means that we're probably spending about $50 billion a year less on our national defense than we would and could do if we had a stronger economy. By the way, if we had a Reagan-style expansion that we had in the 1980s, we would have a $3 trillion larger economy today, and all the more. And by the way, this is the reason, James, we're seeing this fight in the budget about, can we afford to spend more money on tanks and personnel and so on, versus spending money on domestic things, because the economy just isn't growing fast enough. Now, I wanted to mention one other quick thing about this, and then kind of turn it over to the rest, which is that we now have this, you talked about resources. We now have a resource in this country that we didn't know we had 10 years ago. That has, I think, been a game changer if we have the fortitude to use this resource, which is the shale oil and gas revolution, which has really changed the whole geopolitical situation around the world and has the capacity. I've said this for years, it's can become a kind of conventional wisdom, but if we get this right, and if we use the natural resources that we have right now, within 5 years, not only will the United States be an energy not only will we be energy independent, that is North America altogether, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, not only will the United States be energy independent, but we will and should be the energy dominant country in the world. So we should take the place of Saudi Arabia, and we have the resources to do it. I mean, with the shale oil and gas revolution, we've tripled the amount of oil and gas we have. Every time they drill, they're finding more of it. We have 500 years worth of coal. We are the energy dominant country in the world, and we need to use this, and we need to use it for two reasons. Obviously, number one is that it grows our economy. The more oil and gas we produce here and the more coal we produce here, the less we have to buy from abroad. So it strengthens our GDP. But the other point, which is quite obvious, is that when we're buying oil and gas from the rest of the world, yes, we get a lot of it from Mexico and Canada, but there's no question that we're funding our enemies with petrodollars. And so if we can sell this stuff rather than buy it, I think the geopolitical situation changes almost overnight. And it's incomprehensible to me that we have a president right now who, rather than trying to harness these resources that we now have access to, is running around the country and running around the world talking about climate change. Now, climate change is, maybe of the 50 biggest problems facing the world right now, most Americans think it's probably about 49th or 50th in priority. Most Americans think the highest priority, and I think they're quite right, is jobs, the economy, and keeping us safe. The climate change agenda is, I think, impeding our national security in a big way, because guess what? When we withdraw from using our resources like our coal and natural gas and oil, that's not happening abroad. The rest of the world is moving towards coal and oil and natural gas at the same time we're moving away from it. So I'll just end on an optimistic note that I think if we get a regime change in Washington in 2016, there's huge upside potential for the U.S. economy. I really think that, in fact, Jeb Bush, who I met with on Monday, is talking about 4% growth. And I said, Jeb, the only problem I have with that is we should be talking about 5 or 6% growth. I mean, we had quarters under Reagan, we had 8 and 9% growth. We can do this, and especially, James, because we're so below trend right now, that we're going to see, hopefully in the next 5 years, a big pickup period where we make up for that lost ground. And once we see that 4% or 5% growth, that's going to have an enormously positive impact on not just our national economy, but our national security as well.
Well, Steve, thanks for that. I want to say that when we did this book 10 years ago, of the 4 pillars, it was the economic one that we were actually most concerned about, and that was, of course, even before the recession. So it on one hand, it's a little demoralizing to say it's probably still the worst.
It comes down to one thing. One thing that is a sickness in Washington is that and you use the word competitiveness, we don't take competitiveness seriously in this country. We have to for our security and for our economic and national security. And as I said, if we get this right, then we're not going to have to worry about economy.
And not to put words in your mouth, but so on the way forward, you would put liberalizing energy and oil exports pretty high on the list.
Just give you one statistic. People say, oh, how could we possibly get to 4% growth? If we just did one thing, if Barack Obama tomorrow, with one stroke of the pen, allowed the export of our oil and gas, because you all know this is a law that goes back to the mid-1970s during the OPEC oil embargo, we could be selling about $100 to $150 billion more oil and gas a year. That's 1% of GDP right there. So we can do this.
So we turn over to Seb. So I got to tell you, when we did our scoring back then, although we rated the economy as the highest area of concern, winning the war of ideas was a pretty close second to being awful. So how far have we done?
All right. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to stand up to present.
What if we do mind?
He's going to do it anyway.
I'm bigger than you. Sorry.
Ah.
So thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I feel like a bit of an interloper because I didn't have a chapter in the book, but I make up for that by saying that when I was at NDU, I did actually assign this book as a required reading in the courses. So
that's where our books sell.
Right. Exactly. So let me start by saying, if you were writing this book today, James, Paul, you'd have to title it Losing the Long War, because we are losing the long war. I would like to be winning it, but we are losing it. And I'm going to use the work that we've been doing within the US government to argue the case using empirical data. So I have the Hornet Chair at the Marine Corps University, but I also have a company with my wife, the Threat Knowledge Group, and we support elements of the US government, especially USASOC, US Army Special Operations Command, the FBI, and then elements of the intelligence community. I'm going to share the unclassified summary of some of the research we've been doing. So how have the last few years looked? How have we been doing in this war? Why are we still fighting it? The fact is, the news is bad. Just look around the world. Let's ignore Putin. Let's ignore China. This is the reality of the world today. Whether it's Garland, Texas, whether it is this man on the right-hand side in bloody hands who's just decapitated a member of the British Armed Services on the streets of the UK, whether it is Lieutenant Qasas Bey of the Jordanian Royal Hashemite Air Force, an ally partner nation of the United States, being burnt alive by ISIS, or whether the bottom right, we have a Sunni Muslim law enforcement officer being executed gangland style by jihadis on the streets of Paris. And then just when you thought it couldn't get more perverse, we have a video coming out of the Middle East where they're decapitating people not manually with their hands, they're using det cord, they're using detonation cord to decapitate the kufr, the infidel. This is the reality of the long war today. How do we get to where we are today? This is the most recent report we did for Fort Bragg for U.S. Army Special Operations Command. It is unclassified. We were given permission by the Commanding General, Charles Cleveland, to release this. If you are interested in a copy in this, my email is on the last slide and we can share this with you. But let me just give you 4 data points that will illustrate how bad the situation is, probably because people in government did not read this book. So here are the metrics. Number 1, ISIS is a fully fledged transnational insurgency. Al-Qaeda, for all of its power, never really was a serious insurgent threat. It piggybacked itself onto indigenous insurgencies, whether it was al-Shabaab in Somalia or the Taliban in Afghanistan. It never generated its own base, its own cadre. ISIS has, with affiliates in 7 nations, holding territory larger than the territory of the United Kingdom. And think about this, Boko Haram in Africa, not in the Middle East, changed its name recently after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi accepted their oath of bayat, their oath of allegiance. Boko Haram changed its name to the West Africa province of the Islamic State. Now that's stunning. That means that ISIS is de facto in control. Abu Bakr is the Khalif of not only territory in the Middle East, but also Africa. We have never seen this before. So that's metric number 1. The metric number 2, this goes to the economics of it all. It is the richest threat group ever of the non-state variety in human history. Just 2 events, 2 raids on the Iraqi National Bank, let's ignore everything else, netted ISIS $823 million. That is the equivalent of 1,600 9/11s. 9/11 cost al-Qaeda, according to the 9/11 Commission report, $500,000. So if ISIS wants to get serious about taking the threat, the fight to the far enemy, we're talking about a very capable threat. Third, and this is the most obvious, its recruiting capacity. Stunning. The Commanding General called this stunning, and I agree with him. In 10 years, the original al-Qaeda, which was called the MAK, the Arab Services Bureau, the original al-Qaeda in the 1980s recruited 50,000 foreign fighters in a decade. In 10 years, ISIS recruited 22 foreign fighters, not Iraqis and Syrians, in just 12 months. That's very impressive. And a lot of that has to do with the eschatology, the religious narrative they are leveraging. This group is called the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, not Syria, not the Levant. It is talking about Al-Sham, an eschatological concept to do with end times in the Sunnah of Islam. It is leveraging religion, and as a result, has mobilized tens of thousands of fighters. And lastly, most important of all, it declared caliphate. This puts them into another league of threat. Yeah? The Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan Muslimin from 1928 onwards, Al-Qaeda in the 80s and 90s, all of the extremists have wanted to reestablish caliphate. What did ISIS do? They didn't talk about it. They did it from the pulpit of the Grand Mosque in Mosul last June. They have succeeded where every other extremist group has failed, and the caliphate is growing, and this is a magnet for recruitment. So the threat has gone from bad to worse. And just in case I haven't depressed you enough, Everybody knows what this symbol is, I hope. It's not a cycloptic happy face. It is the letter Nun in Arabic. The letter N, when used as graffiti, symbolizes Christians live here. This is from Mosul. ISIS is performing religious genocide. It is marking the houses of Christians and giving them the choice to convert to Islam, to recognize their dhimmi status as infidel kuffars, or to be killed. As a result of Mosul, Raqqa, and all these cities falling, think of this one data point. When America invaded Iraq in 2003, there were 1.4 million indigenous Christians. That's Arab Iraqi Christians, 1.4 million. Today, the latest estimates are less than 200,000 left. That is, however you cut it, religious genocide. That's over 1 million Christians killed or forced into exile. That's the kind of power al-Qaeda dreamt of. ISIS didn't dream about it, they did it. Let me close by bringing this back home, just in case, we have any libertarian isolationists, sorry, non-interventionists, they prefer that, in the audience. Let me bring the story back home. In the last few months, we've been working on unclassified data, analyzing the threat to the United States. This is all open source material. This is the number of US arrests attributed to ISIS in just the last few months. Very interesting. We have a spike this summer. We're looking into the causes for the spike, but if you ignore the spike, what do we have? A constant upward trend. ISIS is taking a very keen interest in this country. Director Comey of the FBI has stated every single field office of the FBI has ISIS cases in every state of America. Then, if you're looking at the exodus into Europe and perhaps even on our southern border, here's another disturbing graph. Look at the ages of people that are being intercepted and arrested. This is in America. Look at the videos of all those so-called refugees. When you get away from the children and the mothers, the vast majority of the people that are fleeing the region fall into what age group? The same age group that are being arrested for being ISIS conspirators. Let's get even more specific. Look at this figure. This is all ISIS arrests in the United States over the last year. 30% of those arrested were not going to go and fight in the Middle East. 30% believed that their membership of ISIS could best be served by carrying out attacks within the United States. That should make everybody concerned. So, let's break it down one last time. If you look at just the numbers arrested, 75 people, 6 minors arrested over a one-year period in the United States linked to ISIS, you look at that figure, then that number, that frequency of arrests equals a 200% increase of ISIS arrests in the United States over a similar period when compared to al-Qaeda. The new brand of global jihadism is ISIS. Al-Qaeda is the JV team, not ISIS. So to conclude, what does this all mean? Well, we are losing this war. That's the sad truth. Why? Because we have an administration, you look at the scandal that's blowing up today about censorship of intelligence analysis within DIA, we have an administration that denies the reality of who the enemy is and what they want. We talk about jobs for jihadis, root causes, local grievances. We're not allowed to actually analyze what they believe they are doing, the religious justification, and the actual things they talk about in Dabiq and all their social media publications. We are empowering others who are just as dangerous as ISIS, and perhaps even more so, and that's Iran. I'm sorry whether you like him or not, you have to agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu. When he addressed Congress, he said, and you have to give it to his speechwriters, anybody addressing another National Assembly, not in his mother tongue, who manages to leverage Game of Thrones, you really have to give it to them, okay? When Bibi goes, to understand the violence in the Middle East today, all you have to understand that it is a Game of Thrones for the crown of the caliphate. It is a deadly Game of Thrones between two versions of the caliphate. The Sunni extremists, AQ, ISIS, al-Nusra, versus who? The mullahs, who want their Shia version of the caliphate and are expanding. Yemen, Damascus, you name it. And we're just about to give them $150 billion to a nation that the President of the United States in an Arabic newspaper called a state sponsor of terrorism earlier this year, the President, before he closed the deal. Thirdly, for political reasons, we have failed to even begin to attack the enemy's center of gravity, which is, of course, its ideology, the war of ideas, as James called it. Even when I'm in Bragg at the Special Warfare School, even when I talk to the FBI agents that we train, I tell them, guys, we're not going to kill or arrest our way out of this war. Don't get me wrong, kinetic stuff is fine, but it's less than 50% of this war. Body bags is a really bad metric for winning. It was stupid during Vietnam, it is stupid now. Like Sun Tzu said, killing enemy units is not the purpose of warfare. The purpose of war is to destroy the enemy's strategy. How do you do that? Well, good news. After depressing you, I'm going to close on a little bit of good news. I am Hungarian, so, I'm a born pessimist, but I'm now American, so I'll have to give you a decent end for it on a positive note. We've done this before. We've won this before. ISIS is just a form of totalitarianism. It's an absolutist totalitarian ideology. In this case, a religious one, but it is a totalitarian ideology. And we have done what? We've defeated the Soviet Union. We defeated communism, another totalitarian ideology, so we can do it again. But we have to be allowed to talk about it, and we have to go on the strategic offensive. I'll stop now, but if you want more details, I wrote a piece on the center of gravity of the jihadist group for the Green Beret magazine, Special Warfare. The whole article is available at that Scrib linked. And also, as a complementary publication, I think, to James and Paul's book, my wife's former organization published this, Fighting the Ideological War, which Hirsi Ali told in the New York Times is the book President Obama needs to read to win this war. This is a game plan, taking the best people from the Security Council under Reagan, putting them in a room with the very best experts on jihad today, and coming up with a game plan to delegitimize the message of our current enemy. Lastly, if you're interested in our Bragg report on ISIS, please shoot me an email. My Gmail is the best. Everything I publish is on my website, thegorkabriefing.com. And what we do for the government is at threatknowledge.org. And then my wife runs a not-for-profit called the Council on Global Security that monitors the growth and expansion of jihadist ideology. So I don't want to steal any more time. If you'd like to continue offline, please get in touch or check out that website. And thank you so much for Heritage for inviting me today.
So Seth, let me ask you just real briefly, is the thing about this 10-year period is it spanned both the Bush administration, the Obama administration. So could you compare and contrast how they've approached this differently?
Well, it's ironic. For all the talk of root grievances, root causes, this administration, whilst on the one hand buying into the social movement theory of how terrorists are created, has actually, if you look at our drone use, has been far more violent. So there's a disjuncture. The not tackling the ideology, unfortunately, James, began in the Bush administration. Yeah, there were certain things that happened, especially in the second term, where they started to say, well, this is not really about ideology, it's about other things, and we're just going to promote democracy. No, you can't promote democracy until you take down the enemy's ideology. So it's been a gradual progression, starting, unfortunately, under the Bush administration, but then getting this new spin where we say it's all about local grievances and ideology is irrelevant, to a current situation where I think it's actually resulted in political censorship of intelligence product. I mean, look at this, 50 IC analysts at DIA. When have we ever had? I mean, you can complain about, cooking the books and sexing up files during, Bush and Blair, but 50 analysts and the IG actually investigating it, that is a bad indicator of how far we have sunk.
So then we turn to hard security and threats.
Well,
Does the news get any better?
You did me no favor in having me follow Professor Gorka in terms of the depth and knowledge that obviously he brings, certainly on the war of ideas portion of this. So I was thinking through what to say today, and then we can pull the string a little bit further on intelligence as it applies to 10 years later in recognition of winning or losing the long war. The evolving nature of the asymmetric enemy that we face breaks down, in my mind, into three major components. As we look at them as the enemy, and until we're prepared to really address, as part of the national narrative and the national dialogue about who they are, I think we will be on the losing side. So I completely identify with that. The first is an enemy who has a cause with an infinite value in which they ruthlessly are committed to seeing it achieved. And at the core of it, we can call it ideology. At the core of it, we can call it religion. It blends in such a way that it's an infinite value that they are prepared to die for. And until you recognize that that's the nature of the enemy that you're fighting, you will get set back time and time and time again. Page 203 of the book. See, I did bring the book just for recognition that I have read it. Foremost, however, we must heed George Kennan's long telegram in his most critical warning, and this is the quote from the telegram: "The greatest danger that can befall us is that we shall allow ourselves to become like those with whom we are coping. We must retain the courage and the confidence to remain true to that which has made our nation great, to the values that make the idea of America worth defending." And here's the key. The infinite value for us is a banner that we must carry into every battle in the long war must read freedom. Freedom. So infinite can only win, whether it's in the intelligence arena or in the servicemen and women in uniform on the battlefield or in the war of ideas or the economy, is this concept of freedom. Secondly, it is as an asymmetric enemy that is highly adaptive to meet its objectives, and we must match those. So in other words, just take, for example, the whole idea of crowdsourcing attacks. You do a call. We're fixated what will happen on a particular 9/11 date as an anniversary. They're far more fixated on crowdsourcing around exactly what you mentioned, a call out, whether it's a Chattanooga that then occurs or a Tunis Beach, it doesn't matter as long as that there's a response. And long gone are the days you have got to have gone and trained with them. Some of them will have, some of them will be those returning foreign fighters that come off of the Syria and Iraq battlefields from their side and return home and do dastardly things, but certainly not all of them. Just ask France. And thirdly, it remains a very attractive magnetism for the youth. And youth is anyone under 56. So I identify with youth. So, looking at the front row here, all of you.
That's a good cutoff. I'm 55. So.
Okay, so you're okay with that. Yeah, okay, good.
I turn 56 next month.
Okay, there we go. Attracted to a youth with little or no hope, and no hope in what, again, because we have blurred Western ideals, we have downgraded what we call freedom, and that infinite value that we attach that won the long war against the Soviet Union in three major pillars: economic, militarily in terms of matching and then topping them, and then ideologically. And it was all around the concept of freedom. So layered on top of all of that then, and the challenge from an intelligence and security standpoint is you have an all-out war between Shia and Sunni. And Syria is the manifestation of that. But when I spoke at the Aspen Security Forum in July of 2013, and the New York Times carried the front page story, for which then subsequently I was taken to the Woodshed. I didn't want to use my own name there, but that sort of thing. For having said it was two things. That currently the al-Nusra front at the time, you didn't have ISIL, you had AQI, and there were some battling for positions and so forth in the summer of 2013, would not be contained inside its own borders because they didn't recognize Syria as the borders of 100 years drawn by the French and the British with a ruler, and they said, those aren't our borders. So it won't stay inside of that as they sought to establish the caliphate. And secondly, in relative strength, that far end of the extremist opposition in Syria would emerge stronger and stronger at the expense of the rest of the opposition because of precisely my first point. They're prepared to die for it. The one fighting for water rights is not necessarily prepared to die for that, even though he or she may be in opposition to Bashar al-Assad. So we're all challenged when we view the long war through Western eyes. In the intelligence community, the first thing you do in your little cubicle or in your office is to build the wiring diagram of the who's who, and we Westernize the idea. I think pandemic is actually a much better descriptor of what this is. What do we do inside, and I can speak for DIA. You siloed the analysts with, oh, I do Boko Haram over here. I'll do Ansar al-Sharia over here. And so on, AQAP in the Arabian Peninsula, and ISIL. I don't think they're thinking that way at all, and you gave clear evidence of that. So what do we do in response? We must first recognize the problems, and this has been very clearly already spoken to, and I'm sure I'll hear to my right further about this, to develop a long war strategy. Today, I don't believe, and having been in government for nearly 33 years, I can't describe a strategy on this. I don't think your Iowan or your Nebraskan can describe it either then, if I don't know it. Just saying. We have no strategy to defeat Islamic extremism, which starts with a narrative in which we don't even call it for what it is. Page 12. See, I'm using your book right on the spot.
Man. Should have done spell check.
Three core principles. We believe the lessons of the Cold War are a checklist for how to conduct or win the long war. 1, organize the fight for the long term. 2, be patient and get it right. 3, do not put off getting it right. Once innovation ends, stagnation begins. I think we're at a stagnant stage. Be prepared in this world of winning the long war to live in the gray. I think we all want to define a world as black and white. And you don't have to like it, but you better get comfortable with gray. And that's, I think, where we live.
So let me just ask you, because one of the things we didn't have 10 years ago when we wrote the book is we didn't have a restive Russia. We didn't have a rising China. We didn't have Iran with $150 billion in cash. So how would you rank ISIS and al-Qaeda among all those threats today?
I think all of those in their emergence are a manifestation of whether key power leaders in state actor form, in the case of Putin, and we did get a telegram from him in Georgia in 2008 that apparently some of us forgot to read, that he was there. There's Russian expertise right in the front second row there. And then Xi Jinping, in terms of China's ascendancy, certainly is no surprise. But nature abhors a vacuum. So in the absence of strength that Steve has described economically and so forth, is that you have, in the rank order of these, is you've got to be able to do them simultaneously. So for example, whether it's the now totally blurred and disappeared, ultimately, red line that the president talked about in Syria vis-a-vis the chemical weapons, and then the subsequent manifestations of Russia's behavior in Crimea, I think they are attached by way of the messaging. And I actually believe in the absence of clear policy and direction by way of Syria today, the Russians are moving in a more forceful way physically into Syria. So they are interrelated, and you can't afford to say, I will only do ISIL as my number one priority and ignore Russia or ignore China or ignore North Korea and certainly not ignore Iran, but rather it's the full spectrum of what a world power is expected to have to deal
So
with.
you wouldn't be necessarily supportive of something like the Asian pivot, the notion that these are problems we could just put on the back burner, or we just focus on China. So
Not at all.
So it's Europe, Middle East, and Asia all at the same time.
We have to do them all at the same time.
So none of this makes any, I mean, the only purpose of any of these activities is to protect the freedoms of American citizens, the fundamental sovereignty government. So it's a good segue to.
Right, that is good.
Yeah, is there any can I have some happy news?
No. Well, the good news is we don't have to worry about the Uruguayan crisis this week,
That's
right?
Where's that?
Oh, well, there is none. That's the point. It's a somber week. I always think at this time. 14 years ago tomorrow, 3 friends of mine passed away, and that makes you think long and hard about the course of where we've come. 10 years ago, we wrote a book, and the portions that I contributed to most were, as Jim said, the idea about doing all of this while maintaining that idea of freedom and liberty that is our intellectual, ideological competitive advantage, and trying to figure out how to do that while also enhancing the security of the United States. Many people at the time posited that as a zero-sum game, a trade-off. That if we were going to increase security, we were going to lose privacy, and if we wanted to protect privacy, we were going to have to give up on security. We rejected that 10 years ago, and I still reject it today. I think if I could give you the 3 points that I think should guide our strategy in this area, thinking of it as a long-term struggle, it's not a balance. The idea is to maximize both security and liberty to the greatest extent possible, and that the 2 ways to implement that are first not to fight technology, but to embrace it, not to reject technological developments as threatening liberty or threatening security, but rather to realize that technology is a neutral. It can be used as a force for good or evil, and that's true of every technological development since the samurai sword, if not before. And we're not going to be able to change that reality. To think otherwise is kind of King Canutean in trying to sweep back the tide. So if you're going to embrace technology and not try and suppress it, then the right way to manage the gray, I like that, the gray, live in the gray of privacy and liberty on the one hand and security on the other. I mean, I have to say on the one hand, on the other, even though I reject the balance, is through governance structures. Things that take the situation as real and use audit, oversight, technologies to kind of manage the process as best you can. We know that that's the way that real-world systems work. The kind of one of the examples from the book that I still think holds today is we do not disarm the police, even today, even after our continued problems with what we perceive as excessive police violence. We're never going to take away their guns because we understand that armed police have both a positive and a potentially negative benefit. The right answers there are, train them well, conduct administrative reviews of every instance in which the police use their weapons, punish those who do it wrong if necessary, fire them, charge them with crimes. All that's to the good. And if there are improvements to the systems of oversight to be made, that's great. We can talk about that. But liberty does not flourish in a world in which legislatures and governments blind themselves to the reality of security needs, and it does not flourish in a system in which we reject technology as beyond the pale, as something we have to get rid of. We see that recurring today in virtually every bit of new kind of tech that's coming along, whether it's biometrics or drones or CCTVs. All of them are part and parcel of this dynamic of security and liberty. And all of them, I think, should be managed in the same way. I think what I would reflect on as having disrupted this, what I thought was a reasonably stable consensus in America, was Snowden, Edward Snowden. He was a change agent. He will go down as the most consequential, I will say traitor, others might say whistleblower, but I will say traitor, most consequential actor on the American stage in the last few years in terms of changing the dynamics of this discussion and causing some people to reject the viability of the oversight and audit model that I pose as the right way forward altogether in favor of a complete distrust of government. That way, I think, lies failure, because that way results in the disempowerment of government in a way that will, in the end, result in the end of liberty itself. John Stuart Mill said that the greatest protector of liberty is the security provided by the state to a free people so that they can act on their own, and I think he's right. So that's the change that's happened in the last 10 years. Did we get anything wrong? I would say one thing that we pretty much missed completely was the extreme growth of cyber-enabled type things. 10 years ago, cyber was, I believe, I haven't checked everywhere, but I believe you'll read the entire book and not see any reference to cyber in that phraseology. And we missed that completely, and that has been a destabilizing piece of the change in the last 10 years that still needs to be ingested and accommodated to the enduring tension that goes on. As for the future, I'm going to actually put my hat on and say I think we're at a bit of a cusp moment. There are some in the world and some in the United States who have grown so distrustful of government and of the possibility of security that we are driving towards a kind of uber-libertarianism, if you will, that exiles government from the security sphere and disables it. And I think that way is a realistic possibility on the body politic. It would be, in my judgment, extremely unfortunate, but it's a real possibility. The other failure mode I see down the road is that we drive in that direction until something catastrophic recurs again in the United States, in which case I would think that the counter-revolution, the Thermidorian reaction to it, would be even greater and more disruptive of liberty in the United States. So what I hope for in my own way is a return to what I thought was a pretty carefully constructed architecture of control that was imperfect because it was human in nature and was not in any way absolute. And that's what we say is the stable way to win the long war. Not giving up your fundamental liberties, but recognizing the reality of threats. We're in a disrupted place right now, and I hope we can get back to that.
So, 10 years ago when we wrote the book, we were kind of in the middle of this Manichaean, irrational, and uncivil debate about the Patriot Act.
Mm-hmm.
And after 10 years of living in this world, we have a Manichaean, uncivil, and irrational debate about metadata collection.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, we have really huge issues of huge import, like the European Declaration of the Right to be forgotten, and the administration's kind of haphazard to just give up control of ICANN without a governance structure going forward, which have huge implications for the way we exercise privacy and liberty online. That leaves me kind of, have we learned nothing in 10 years from all of this?
Well, I actually thought a little better of it than you did. We had this debate about the Patriot Act, but in the end, the overwhelming majority of Americans recognized that it wasn't this totally. I used to go around giving a talk. John Ashcroft is not Darth Vader, was its title. And in the end, that's where most people settled. We went with the Protect America Act, the FISA Amendments Act. We reached a very nicely settled place that, would I cut and paste cut on trim on one end or the other? Sure. And we could have a nice discussion about that. But we've returned to that Manichaean debate. And I think a large fraction of that is due to the highly disruptive and I think highly tendentious way in which recent disclosures are being portrayed by either true purveyors of ill will to the United States or useful fellow travelers.
Can I cycle back to Steve for a second? Because listening to the other parts of this conversation ties back to something that you talked about. So we were talking about the war of ideas, and and this notion of liberty and protection, and the promotion of democracy has been part of it as well. And then you were talking about economic policy, but so where does the idea of economic freedom fit in? Does that have a role, and is that part of what we should be doing going forward? Is it part of the discussion of where we are now?
Sure. I mean, you grow when you have economic freedom. That's the whole point of our index of economic freedom that we do. I mean, this isn't complicated stuff, really. The countries that have the most economic freedom have the fastest rates of economic growth. So it's clear if we want to support financially the kinds of initiatives that we need to undertake to defeat the war against terrorism, we're going to have a flourishing economy. And actually, I wanted to ask Professor Gorka a question about something that he had said that I thought was.
Can I just?
Yeah, it was related to this, but go ahead.
Yeah, but no, I just want to ask. So, how are we doing in terms of not about economic freedom domestically, but what's our grade for promoting economic freedom?
That's a great question. It's leading by example. I would get rid of all foreign aid. Foreign aid is a complete waste of money. The way we promote economic freedom around the world is be economically free ourselves. I mean, that's the lesson that I think Reagan taught the world in the 80s. We cut tax rates. What did other countries have to do? They cut tax rates. We promoted free trade. They became more free trade. This is one of the dangerous things about Trump talking about if the United States, we're the hub of the world economy. If we're not a free trade nation, then trade breaks down everywhere. So I'm just a big believer. We do this by example. We get it right here, and others will follow. And this is related to what I wanted to ask you about, because as I look at the victory of the Cold War, I mean, this really was a Reagan strategy, among other things, of just, we're going to outgrow you. We're going to produce so much more than you do that you can't possibly win. You made this interesting comment about the fact you don't win these wars by killing the enemy. You defeat their strategy. Reagan's strategy, at least in part in the 80s, was we're going to outgrow you. What is the strategy of defeating this new enemy that I don't think we've ever really confronted before?
Well, I mean, the question is very trenchant, because you want to grow because you believe in growth being a good thing, and in America's leadership being an actual good, an international good. If you have an administration that actually looks at America as a net qualitative non-asset, as a derogatory thing, then you can't do the other half of Sun Tzu's equation. Everybody loves to quote Sun Tzu, know thy enemy. Well, just read the actual book. That's not what he says. He says if you want certitude in war, you must know yourself and why you are fighting and the enemy. Right? And if you don't think America's good, you will not win any war. You just will not win it. Right? Just, it will not happen. If you look in the mirror and say, ooh, I'm a crypto imperialist, right? then you're not going to win. You're not going to win. Right? So we're missing that first part of the equation that says economic growth, freedom, connected. Right. It's good. We represent it.
This is sort of the idea of American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Right. So David, did you want to?
No, it applies to intelligence. If you're apologetic around the world about what you do with intelligence, and like all things that start at home, and you're apologetic to the community, the president has yet to show up at NSA and actually have a workforce engagement on it. So that tells you volumes about where his heart, if not also his mind, is on intelligence as part of the winning strategy.
James, there's a great, if I may, I just want to circle back to something you said. It reminded me of this story that a big part of war is propaganda, right? And in the 1940s and 50s, the Soviets, used propaganda very effectively. One of the things that they did in the Soviet Union was when the movie The Grapes of Wrath came out,
right.
They showed this movie all over Eastern Europe. And some of you may have heard this story. And this was, look at how evil, capitalism is. Look at how poor these farmers are. They don't, and it totally backfired, because all these, poor farmers in Russia, they're like, look at the United States. In the United States, even the poor farmers have cars. So sometimes the propaganda doesn't work.
And get to own their land.
So you know, another movie that they showed was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is to show all this corruption in Washington. And they said, the people there get a vote? Let me swing, we're just about at the witching hour here, so let me just swing back to Paul real quick. And on reflection, 10 years later, is there anything you would have done differently, other than we missed cyber? We didn't talk about cyber all that much.
I think one of the reasons that we're in a disruptive place is that we overemphasize the necessity for keeping some of what we're doing secret. I agree wholeheartedly that we shouldn't be apologizing for our intelligence, but I do think that systematically we didn't do a very good job of communicating why we do, what is necessary, how it works, what the things are in place that actually are protective of liberty, that prevent the NSA from becoming a rogue institution. We did a really bad marketing job.
You know, I said one thing. I think, you know, I thought back then that we were in kind of the early 1950s. You know, if you to the Cold War analogies. In other words, you know, we'd been through Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, but there was, by the time you get to the end of the Eisenhower, there is this kind of growing Cold War consensus, and in many ways, this is
Even the AFL-CIO,
Right,
you know,
exactly,
was,
yeah,
was
yeah.
in favor of winning.
Yeah.
I don't think that they are necessarily on our side now.
Probably not. But there, I mean, not that partisanship went away and that there weren't debates, but Republicans and Democrats on these big national security issues, they were all in the same room, and I think that's where we thought we were. That 9/11 in some ways was a focusing moment coming out of the Cold War, where people started to come to grips with what is America's place in the 21st century as a global power with global interests, and not just for terrorism. How are we going to do that? And so I think our notion was we're going to kind of build towards that. I don't think what we didn't anticipate was Katrina and the intense backlash to the war and the incredible vitriol and the great partisan divide in the political class, where today you can't find a Scoop Jackson, right? You can't find people in different political parties who have similar views on national security and foreign policy interests. And then look at the vote on the Iran with such very, very small exceptions. There's almost an utter political divide in the U.S. Senate. I think that's incredibly unhealthy for us, because you can only do the kind of things we talk about in the book with some modicum of political consensus in that country. So I guess the great question is with or here, is it regardless of how the elections come out, is it another decade of utter political division in the United States, or are we ever going to get back towards something like the national security consensus that you need to have in order to move the Americans forward as one people? So that's on that happy note. I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to ask you to join with me in thanking this awesome panel. And thank you. You still find the book on Amazon if you.
Used though.
Used, yeah. Because we are out of print, which was good.
We really should.
We sold.
We should do it. Winning the Long War 10 years later.